And you are live.
Okay, good morning, everyone. This is Senate Transportation Committee. We're trying to get some progress made on S-280, the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill, which we had sent to the House. And I think they moved it out yesterday. Is that correct? I thought they moved it out yesterday with a lot of changes. So anyway, Anthea, would you like to take us through it, or we have Commissioner with us, Deputy Commissioner, and EMT all with us this morning, so I'm trying to make some progress on this bill. I think there's a lot more since it left here, a lot more in it. So
yeah, they added, but they didn't really change. So I have an updated side by side that reflects. I'll do one this way.
It is different than the one you gave.
It is slightly different than the one from Mitch. Actually, do you want to get that to Senator? Thank you. And then Senator Persick, that one should go to Senator Kitchell. I think Senator Muff.
what's the easiest way? Senator Kitchell's not with us. She has a meeting. What's the easiest way to go through? We agree as we go through. How do we want to handle that? Try to get some of it off the books. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Why don't we do that? If you have any input, jump in, please, because we're trying to get. We only have a short period of time, but we don't have the bill, but it'll be here when tomorrow or.
I don't know if it gets referred back to the committee.
Okay.
I think it'll end up being on your notice calendar.
Okay.
Soon.
I'd like to get all we can this week, at least get it pretty well wrapped up. So why don't we start, and Anthea, take us through and see what we can agree and disagree on.
Okay, great. So for the record, Anthea Dexter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel. So what the House did was they had two instances of amendment from their House Transportation main amendment. And that was what happened before second reading. And they made one change to your language, which we'll go through in the side by side. And then they added a whole bunch of sections at the end. So there is a lot of agreement and then a lot of language that you haven't seen yet.
Okay.
And then there was one floor amendment that was made yesterday before third reading. And that changed slightly some of the language that the House is proposing to add, which is why I wanted to get you the updated side by side because it'll be reflected there. So first instance of amendment, I'm just going to go through the side by side to sort of refresh everyone's memory. So section 1, this was the alignment of the new motor vehicle arbitration and the window that you had to recommence your arbitration. They didn't make any changes.
Okay. Again, anytime you folk hear something, just please jump in. So we have no issues for that first section of something we had. Okay. All right.
Okay.
Good.
So section 2, this was a section that made the changes to the total abstinence program. In general, they made no changes. The only change that they made was in the definition of drug, and I'm on page 4 at the bottom. This came up when I was testifying in House Judiciary, and I think it sort of clarifies a potential ambiguity. So for your definition of drug, you've got that two-part definition. It's a regulated drug unless it is being used as prescribed for a legitimate medical use in conformity with instructions from the prescriber. So you've got regulated drug means regulated drug with that small carve out, or any substance or combination of substances other than alcohol that potentially affects the nervous system, etc. So the question was, what if that regulated drug that was being used in conformity with the prescriber's instructions for a legitimate medical use, what if that then falls under subdivision 2? And I don't think it was anyone's intent that it would. It was supposed to be a carve out. So if you had your prescription, it wouldn't fall under drug. So this is just clarifying that, much like alcohol is dealt with separately, regulated drug is dealt with separately. So all regulated drugs would still be considered a drug unless it was that legitimate medical use in conformity with instructions from the prescriber. And if it's not a regulated drug, if it's a regulated drug that could not be prescribed, such as cannabis, then that would still fall under the regulated drug piece because it couldn't be prescribed. And if it was a substance other than a regulated drug or alcohol, then it would fall under subdivision 2. And that's not something that could be prescribed, so it wouldn't need to fit into that carve out. So I think you are addressing a potential ambiguity there. House Transportation agrees with House Judiciary's recommendation.
All right, folks?
Yeah.
Okay,
No loopholes there that were unintended loopholes with that language.
okay, good. Yep. Okay,
Okay, so no other changes to the total abstinence program. That's section 2. And no changes, I'm now on page 8, to the implementation language around the total abstinence program with saying what the commissioner needs to do in terms of notice and drawing that line in the sand and saying these are the rules that apply going forward. No changes in section 4, which was what was addressing the 3 means to legally pull milk at 90,000 pounds, getting rid of that $10 permit and streamlining the permit process there. No changes there.
okay.
That'll take you to section 5, page 12. This is the change for non-resident title if the commissioner is not satisfied as to the ownership of the vehicle and the bonding option only being available if you're a Vermont resident. No changes there. Then have your 2 purchase and use tax taxable cost definition changes. The first one is having the registered or titled, the or titled being added several times to account for the fact that there are title only transactions that would trigger the requirement that you pay the purchase and use tax. No changes there. And then at the bottom of page 14, no changes in getting rid of that language that's obsolete because there aren't any leases from 1995 still in existence. Section 7, this was having the proof that you needed to show under one of the exceptions, and there are other exceptions that would apply, but for someone who's moving to Vermont and can show that their vehicle was registered in another state that assessed a purchase and use tax, there's no longer the requirement to show it for 3 years. No changes there. I'm now on the bottom of page 15. These were your 2 towing abandoned vehicle sections. No change to your definition of motor vehicle for purposes of what is abandonable. And no changes to your shift, and this is in section 9, from the 30 days to 90 days for the window that that paperwork needs to be filed.
Right, you agree with all that, okay.
So that gets you to the end of what was in your bill. And then you had a section 10, your effective dates. And now we're going to start the 6 new sections that they added.
Page 17, right?
Page 17.
Okay, that's, we got that. All right, now we go from there.
Okay, so we're talking about transportation network companies. Transportation network companies are, they're Uber, they're Lyft. In Vermont, there's also Green Cab, but they're a way to arrange a ride using a device. When you had Capstone and Sue Minter and Chris Poland talking about their ideas for rural Uber, and they were saying, well, it's kind of like this transportation network company, but it's going to be a little bit different. We're now talking about transportation network companies. So it would have been 5 years ago, the General Assembly added a Chapter 2, Title 23 to address transportation network companies. And a lot of what it was doing was addressing insurance requirements, the background check requirements, and one of the pieces that was considered in the legislation that was passed was the fact that at the time, the city of Burlington had a regulatory scheme that addressed transportation network companies. Now I need to do another one of my city of Burlington disclaimers. At the time, I worked for the city of Burlington and I testified on the bill that became the chapter in Title 23. One of the things that was added as 23 VSA section 754, we're now going to use a lot of like legal buzzwords. Preemption language. This is when the law of a state is superior to the law of a municipality. You get preemption when the law of a federal government is superior to a state government. So there is a preemption clause, and it says that municipal ordinances, resolutions, or bylaws that regulate transportation network companies are preempted to the extent that they are inconsistent with the provisions of this chapter. So that was what was in the law. Then the city of Burlington, for example, would not be able to have its regulatory scheme to the extent that it was inconsistent with the provisions of the chapter. That's the preemption clause. There was also a savings clause added. That's in subsection B. And that says that subsection A of the section will not apply to a municipal ordinance, resolution, or bylaw regulating transportation network companies if, and then there's two parts. It needs to have been adopted by a municipality with a population of more than 35,000 residents based on the 2010 census. And it needed to have in effect on July 1, 2017, that regulatory scheme. That's only the city of Burlington.
34,999.
And then that's your savings clause. And then the last sentence, this subsection shall be repealed on July 1 of, and it originally said 2020. That is your sunset. So it had a preemption clause, a savings clause, and a sunset. 2 years ago, you pushed out at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, you pushed the sunset out 2 years. So this savings clause, what allows Burlington to have a regulatory scheme that's inconsistent, that will go away on July 1 of 2022 unless the sunset is pushed out. So if you do nothing on July 1 of 2022, subsection B is basically stripped away. It is struck out of statute. So we would just have the preemption piece. House Commerce worked on this language, and they are suggesting that the sunset be pushed out 3 years to July 1 of 2025, but they're not suggesting that that be done in a vacuum. They are suggesting in section 11 that there be a transportation network companies report. So the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles would need to consult with the city of Burlington, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and transportation network companies that are doing business in the state to file a written report with recommendations on how, if at all, to amend 23 VSA section 754. That's the language just above your preemption, savings, sunset language. And if applicable, the balance of 23 VSA chapter 10, which is where you've got your background check requirements, the audits that need to be done by the DMV, the insurance requirements, et cetera. And that report needs to come back to the House committees on Commerce and Economic Development, on Judiciary and Transportation, and the Senate committees on Finance, on Judiciary, and on Transportation by March 15th of 2024. I'm going to stop and talk about the dates for a second. March 15th, 2024 is there's a lot of time between March 15th of 2024 and July 1 of 2025. It'll be the tail end of one legislative session, a summer if there needs to be something worked on in a study committee, and then the next legislative session before 2025. So it's giving a significant amount of time from when the report comes in to when the sunset needs to be acted upon next. And then we have in subsection B, what needs to be looked at in preparing the report. And my apologies, all of A and B, all of that language, that should be underlined. That's just it is all new. That is just 100% an error in the formatting of the side-by-side, and I will correct that. I was looking at it, I'm like, why isn't this underlined? It all should be underlined. So subsection B says what the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles needs to review related to transportation network companies as part of preparing this report. Commissioner of Motor Vehicles needs to look at changes in ridership and consumer practices for calendar years 2018 to 2023. That's going to be the window that there was the chapter regulating TNCs in state law, and sort of as it was ramping up in the state, and it's going to cover both pre and post-COVID. So you would see changes in ridership after there's sort of a resumption of normalcy in terms of that form of public transit. And the changes in ridership needs to also look at market penetration across the state to see if transportation network companies are widespread or if it's just a mostly Burlington, Chittenden County means of public transit. The second thing needs to be looked at is the results of and process for audits that are conducted on a state or municipal level. Burlington has its audit process, and then in statute, there's the state audit process. An analysis prepared by the city of Burlington and the TNC, so it's not an analysis that the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles would need to prepare, just an analysis that the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles would need to review, but it's going to be prepared by the city of Burlington and the TNCs, of the differences between the state's regulatory scheme and the city of Burlington's regulatory scheme. And I'll just give an example of one that comes up a lot. Under the state law, to drive for a transportation network company, you need to be 18. Under Burlington's ordinance, you need to be 21. And there are also some changes in the insurance requirements and some of the disqualifying offenses for the background check. And then as part of that analysis, the City of Burlington and the transportation network companies need to include whether allowing those inconsistencies between the state and the municipal regulatory scheme are or will be detrimental or beneficial to any of the following: the state, the traveling public, transportation network companies, the City of Burlington, or other municipalities. And then the final thing that the commissioner needs to review is any significant regulatory changes on a national level. So these two sections from the recommendation of House Commerce go together. Sunset extended 3 years, gives you until 2025 to figure out what you want to do about Burlington being able to have these inconsistencies, and a report that would come back in March 15th of 2024, prepared by the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles in consultation with, and then it lists the things that need to be reviewed by the commissioner, one of which is going to be an analysis that has to be prepared by the City of Burlington and the TNCs.
What's the thought, ladies and gentlemen?
I just need to, can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Because I need to understand this better, because I don't. Is this just to put pressures on Ubers and Lyfts and all of that to get them so that they're not competing with the state of Vermont? Or what is this? I just don't understand what they're trying to do here.
So several years ago, there was an effort to put into state law regulation of TNCs to require
So
certain.
TNCs, are we talking about companies like Uber, Lyft?
Yeah, when I say TNC, I'm talking
Okay,
about.
so we're talking about other companies and all of that. And so what they're trying to do is regulate it and make it a business model different than what these companies are bringing to the table.
I do not think it is necessarily changing their business model. This is not doing anything like what is happening in California with gig economy regulations and saying you need to treat them as an employee, not an independent contractor. This is simply saying these are the insurance requirements that you need to have, the different stages within the provision of the ride, like depending on whether you're going to pick up a customer, whether you're transporting a customer, whether you're not logged into the system, what insurance you need to carry, what would prohibit you from driving for one of those companies in the state of Vermont, an audit process that the commissioner needs to do, which the DMV can tell you about it. But I do not think Uber or Lyft or Green Cab would say that the state statute is forcing them to change their business model. I also don't think they would say that about the City of Burlington's regulatory scheme.
One last question. I know you guys, I got a question. I apologize, but thank you.
No, it's good. I understand it.
So, and are they saying that they want cities only this size, like over 35,000 residents, to be able to comply with this? Or are they trying to make it comply statewide?
So there is a state regulatory scheme, and then there is a city regulatory scheme. The city regulatory scheme predates the state regulatory scheme. So the City of Burlington passed a vehicle for hire ordinance. Vehicles for hire would cover TNCs or like a traditional cab. The City of Burlington enacted their regulatory scheme before the state enacted its regulatory scheme. 5 years ago, I think it was, when the state law was being enacted, they put in a preemption clause to say, you can't have a municipal ordinance that's inconsistent with our state regulatory scheme. But it gave 2 years for those inconsistencies to last. That was then pushed out another 2 years, and then this would push it out another 3 years with this report to figure out if the City of Burlington should be able to continue having its slightly different regulatory scheme.
Thank you.
And one thing, and I think you'll hear this from the commissioner, when I was tasked with drafting the language for Section 11 by House Commerce, I worked with the City of Burlington and I worked with Chris Rice, the lobbyist for Uber, and they were in agreement with the language that went to House Commerce. I don't know if they still like it, but they were supportive of the language that the commissioner and I worked with.
Just in context, I thought I would add is a very tragic event occurred in Burlington, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago, that preempted all this, where anybody was Ubering, driving as an Uber vehicle, and there was an incident where an Uber driver that we had no idea who it was, what insurance they had, they weren't known to anybody. picked somebody up from the airport and then sexually assaulted that person. And so you can Google it and set it.
Yeah, I've seen that.
So this is to have some standards to who can be an Uber in the city district of Burlington.
Yes. Comments? It's all right, this section.
What I appreciate about it, I just want the committee to know, in working with Anthea, is the time that's been given, because the original had a very much shorter time frame. I think the analysis has to occur. And I think one of the most important things in the changes in working with them was the analysis prepared by the city of Burlington was originally the DMV, and I just said I don't have the capacity to do it. And we'll, in working with this language, if it moves forward, we will work together from a policy standpoint to have someone help us do the evaluation as Burlington sends it in.
So do I get agreement on this section or are you all right with this?
You guys are all set? You guys are good?
Yes,
So
yes.
that's section 10 and 11?
Yep.
Okay, so we are okay with that. Okay. Move on to section 12, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, section 12, this is going to be the first of two standalone reports unrelated to any changes in statute. The first one is a report on increasing the gross weight limits on highways through a special annual permit and requiring an update on the status of a permit portal that you directed the DMV to start developing a few years ago. This language is somewhat related to the fact that you are dealing with the milk hauler permits, but it's not changing anything about what you have in section 4 with the milk hauler permits. This would be much like there are these special annual permits that you can get that allow you to haul at 90,000 pounds and 99,000 pounds, even though you can only register in Vermont to 80,000 pounds unless you've got your sort of milk hauler piece. This would be looking at increasing that over 99,000 pounds up to 117,000 pounds, which is what I believe New York and Quebec have as their top out for permits. So it requires the Secretary of Transportation or designee to collaborate with the Commissioner of, and I'm going to pause here because collaboration with was changed from consultation with through a floor amendment yesterday. So House Transportation had in consultation with. There was a floor amendment. It had not unanimous support from House Transportation, but it had support from House Transportation to change from consultation with to collaboration with. I was asked in House Transportation the difference between consultation and collaboration, and I started talking about English dictionary definitions. And then I was back in my office later, and I was reading the just released skeletal guidance for the carbon reduction program, which we've talked about here. And they have in it two definitions. One is for consultation and one is for collaboration. And collaboration under that is more encompassing, involving, less I need to touch base with you and consult with you, and more I actually need to work with. So the Secretary of Transportation or designee needs to collaborate with the Commissioner of Forest, Parks and Recreation or designee, the Executive Director of VLCT or designee, and the President of the Vermont Forest Product Association or designee. And the Secretary will have the assistance of the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles or designee.
Now, this only pertains to logging trucks?
It does not only pertain to logging trucks, but it is being prompted by requests from the logging.
Are we allowed under federal restrictions to do this?
Well, this would,
Federal highway.
this would not be commodity specific. It would be related to just increasing them. And I think that is something that would certainly come up with if there was an issue on a federal level in the study. It is not something I have looked into.
So one of the things that we're running into now, and I know it's up around our neck of the woods, is that the other states around us have these higher weight limits. So these trucks aren't coming into Vermont. They don't want to get charged overweight permit, and they don't want to get in trouble, so they're avoiding Vermont. I think that if they want to go from New Hampshire to cross Vermont to go to New York, these trucks are having problems getting through Vermont because they don't have because Vermont's not up to date with the weight limits. Is that what's going on?
So, excuse me, so first of all, the only state that exceeds that is not aligned with Vermont is New York. Our neighboring states are in alignment with, our weight limitations and our permits.
Are we higher than them already?
We're lower. New York
We're
is
lower, okay.
117,000 pounds.
Right.
Massachusetts and New Hampshire are all with us.
You got the data off the top of your head? I know Maine and New Hampshire. Okay.
Maine is 100,000 maximum, right? And New Hampshire and Massachusetts are 99.
So they're with us.
So they are with us. The other thing that I think is important for the committee to consider, which we've been consistent in testimony, is this also could impact municipalities, which we don't, their roadway, and it could change what occurs at that level, which we don't manage. And to your question, Senator, the agency has testified that the language in the weight increase, we testified last year, I believe, and this year, that there is concern that this could impact, and most likely would impact, our financial contributions from the federal government. Because we're saying our road infrastructure could handle more weight, and part of our funding mechanism is based on Vermont's needs and the amount of revenue we bring in to manage our roadway. And so we get more statewide. I believe it's Vermont and Hawaii or Alaska. I have Hawaii on my mind. So that is a concern which we have expressed. We did do a report last year, which we did identify some of the financial concerns.
What about the granite? The granite stays within limits, right? Granite trucks, 99,000. Everybody's 99,000. So we are opening it up to broaden it now to other.
So to be very clear, this is not changing the limits. This is having a study and a report back on considerations around lifting the limits. It is not changing anything.
Okay, yes.
But there are definitely people who would like them increased.
Yes.
Definitely concerned jeopardizing federal funding. I'm also worried heavier loads with these long stretches of rural highway, that's more potholes, right? The heavier loads is what shakes the underlayment, which increases the amount of potholes. I get enough complaints about that, I'll say.
I'm not an engineer, but that is my understanding, Senator.
So this is a study that has to come back within a year or something?
January 15th, 2023, and would come back to the House and Senate Committees on Transportation. It's the very bottom of page 18.
Is there any changes? I know this is a question in my mind. I want to be very cautious about this, but this has been talked about before. What should we do or should not do? Is there any recommendations?
Well, I guess I would state that we already know emphatically that this could jeopardize our federal funding. And the loggers have the ability to get a single-use permit to move their loads. So it's not as though they're prohibited.
Oh, they can do that now.
Is that right?
Just special purpose.
Up to 99,000.
Up to 99,000.
What's the, well, at what point do you need this overweight permit? 80,000?
Thank you for clarifying that. No, it's good. And so, you know, I think we can study it and we can spend a lot of time and money and effort. And when we have the DMV core system to deliver, we have the new IIJA to deliver, you know, we have the funding of our highways to deliver. And so when EVs are coming, and it just seems as though, you know, whether it's necessary at any time or not, now is not the time in terms of our workload and what we understand about the federal implications.
I'm just nervous about this. This has been proposed before, and I'm just nervous about it. I don't want to open up the floodgate. Something's going to happen. Yes.
And so we're late in the day, we're late in the hour. Who's driving this language? We're all of a sudden, well, we've had all this time to talk about this, and we're coming in the last day, the last hour. Who's adding this to the bill?
So this language was added by House Transportation in there.
Who's driving them to add it? So somebody
I'm
is.
going to tell you what is sort of available in the public sphere, but there are a lot of, you know, much like you have conversations and I'm not privy to them, there's a lot that I'm not, you know, privy to in terms of motivation behind things. But this language was added by House Transportation in its committee report amending the bill as the Senate passed it. The floor amendment came from Representative Rogers. There is language in the Rural Economic Development Bill that I believe just sat on the wall in House either Natural or Commerce that had language that actually would have not said study this, but would have increased the menu of special annual permits to create a permit that went up to 117,000 pounds. And there was a short form bill that was introduced by Representative Rogers and others that would have done the same thing, that sat on House Transportation's wall and didn't move. So there is legislation that was introduced and didn't move that would have actually made the change. What House Transportation included in its amendment was a study on it.
We've only got 1 week left, presumably. This requires a lot of testimony, I believe. It's late. I mean,
It's just a study, so
yeah, but
Who's paying for the study?
It is not specified here, so it would come out of the Agency of Transportation as the consulting, the entity that then needs to consult with.
Study or not, I do see value in some studies. I'm just concerned that why do I want to explore this? Why do we want to possibly evaluate adding weight to our roads when it'll jeopardize federal funding, increase potholes, and when we're also consistent with Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine? They are all of more similar rurality than our good friends in New York who like to charge tolls on highways to pay for the roads that get chewed up by the heavier loads. So I'm not necessarily supportive of even wanting to enable heavier loads on our roads.
well, that would be the purpose of the study, is to see what the cost benefit is. It's obviously a benefit to the loggers if they can haul one load with 115,000 from the log landing to the mill.
But you can justify that at any
Right,
company,
well,
not
that's
just
why
loggers.
Right, well, that's why you do the study. So is it worth it? We're jeopardizing federal funds, tearing our roads, we have less funds to pay for it, and if it just means a couple extra trips for the logging trucks, well, then let's not do it. But I'm not saying I'm gonna die on my sword that we do a study, but I'm just saying that's why you would do it. Like the logging and folks are saying, this would be helpful if we could fully load the trailer instead of only load the 90,000 pounds.
I can see what they wanted.
Right.
Why would they want it? You could put more load.
I'm starting to remember a little bit of the discussion started and it was like, that's the way it is. It was just hard to figure out how much weight that they had on the landing and coming out on the roads, but I don't know.
How do that?
I think it's a guessing. I think
The way that
You
they're loaded.
can't,
They
it's
don't.
almost impossible out in the,
they get to a level of where they know how high the logs go, the density of what they're hauling and all that. They probably know a lot better than what we do as far as how heavy or how high they can load their
I
trailer.
followed
with
a log
what
truck
trailer
yesterday. I don't think you put another log in that truck. I'll tell you, it was stacked 3 and it was right to the top. And I said, I was following, I counted the logs in the back and I counted, I was following them. And boy, how we could put any more logs in that truck. I don't know how we did it, but
Clarifying question.
yes, go ahead.
So was this from the House committee or was this the floor amendment?
This was from the House committee. The floor amendment was changing in the very beginning of subsection A, consultation with to collaboration with, and then the addition of subdivision B7, which would require as part of the examination leading to the report, looking at the impacts of any additional special annual gross vehicle permits on the forest economy and on the management and forest cover of Vermont's landscape. That was the other piece that came from the floor.
I suspect this is probably gonna go to a committee conference anyway, so I would recommend we take it out, but that's just my opinion. Do what you wanna do. I don't care. At this point, because we've gotta go to a committee conference anyway. Senator Ingalls,
I'm gonna follow the chair's lead as far as on that. That's what I'm gonna do.
for now, I think I can get we'll take it out and then we'll worry about it as we go down, because we've only got a few days. I don't know how deep we're gonna get. Okay, distracted driving, is that 13?
Yep, section 13,
That's why
another.
they want to lock people up for 3 years or something, or?
So another one that's just a report, there is a bill that sat on House Transportation's wall, H262, that was introduced by Representative Smith. The committee took testimony on including a modified iteration of H262 in the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill and ended up just going with a report. So section 13 has some findings about distracted driving, and then subsection B requires the Vermont State Highway Safety Office in consultation with departments of motor vehicles and of public safety the Vermont Sheriff's Association, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, the Vermont Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, the Vermont Association of Court Division and Pretrial Services, and the Vermont Judiciary to file. So it would be the Vermont State Highway Office that's going to be filing the written recommendations after consulting with those entities. Written recommendations on how, if at all, the state should modify its approach to the education, enforcement, and conviction of the non-commercial driver's license distracted driving violations under 23 VSA sections 1095A, B, and 1099, with the House and Senate committees on Judiciary and on Transportation on or before January 15th, 2023. And as part of making any recommendations, the Vermont State Highway Office needs to review what is and what is not currently working to minimize distracted driving in Vermont and other states, especially amongst operators under 18 years of age, and examine monetary penalties, points, suspensions, revocations, and recalls, including an escalation based on the location and number of distracted driving violations, the use of diversion programs and other mandated education, and how to balance education, enforcement, and conviction to address distracted driving. So again, no changes to the distracted driving laws, no changes to the points, no creation of a diversion program, no mandatory education. A report comes back January 15th, 2023, looking at and making recommendations on.
Perfect.
Isn't this what the state highway safety office does, like anyway? This is what they do, they're supposed to be doing?
They do, we have extensive across multimedia platforms, campaigns to address distracted driving and other safety issues. And we monitor best methods and how to address this. The administration does not favor changing fines or increasing points in terms of what's already there in statute, and Commissioner Benelli can build upon that.
But just to be clear, that their purpose is to always look at these things, not only to keep things safe, but they're always basically doing what the report is saying. Look at it, what's working, what's not working, make changes. So it's an example of telling them to do what they're already doing, but it just makes it more work because they got to file the report.
Right.
Question? Comment?
I will share with the committee that, in line with what Ms. Shell just said, the proposal on distracted driving and the original language and the multiple drafts that came out, we've been opposed to for a number of reasons, beyond the fines and penalties. It was, and this language has changed. I did not testify on this amendment. I testified on the other amendments, and it's coming back to the point that the purpose of the study, outside of I think the excellent point that you made.
That hurt. Take the mask down here. Oh, let's see this. Oh my God, hey, it's accepting. I can't believe it.
I had a weird voice message from some Mazda that said I needed to get up here.
Where the hell have you been anyway?
Listen, we had the pleasure of meeting on top.
I'm Peg Flory. I used to.
Yeah, she used to, when I said, oh,
Yeah.
there's some bits up there for you.
Yeah.
There. Huh?
Okay.
I heard you're running for the Senate again. There's an empty seat in Rutland.
Your hearing is still defective. But it said I had to wear a mask, but apparently I don't.
Yeah.
That's fine.
If you're off camera, nobody
You're welcome to sit down here for a moment if you'd like. You got a minute. You
knows. Take your
can
own
listen
seat.
to it. You don't want to comment. Go right ahead.
You must need to take notes.
Yeah. So where are we on this?
So just on the distracted driving report, so I think that we've been very, very clear on, the penalties and, on the suspensions and the revocations. And to the committee, I think you also are aware that DMV on the other side is being asked to constantly look at its statutes and reduce first offenses or suspensions and to evaluate all of our statute. So I've been clear in testimony that this is actually having us look at increasing on this side, but decreasing on the other side. And I think it's in the best interest that if we continue to evaluate 23 and we look at that, we're looking at it holistically, not in a bifurcated manner. And this would be another study. They did take it, remove it from DMV, that it did originate there, and they've moved it over to the State Highway Safety, and I think Michelle has talked about.
Yeah.
Governor's Highway Safety Council?
Yeah,
Work on it? Well, they're doing that now, right?
they're already doing it, and once again, this would be another burden on staff, distracting us from the work that we're trying to do in advancing these programs.
I think I remember this 5 years ago.
Yeah. Comments, from the committee? Take it out, take it out, out. Good. Next one's a real exciting one. Okay, Eileen.
Okay, section 14, this requires the Department of Environmental Conservation, Air Quality and Climate Division to consult with the Departments of Motor Vehicles and Public Safety to implement a public outreach campaign on idling that at a minimum addresses, and then it lists a number of things. So I'm just going to pause here. These 4 items, subdivisions 1 to 4, come from a website that already exists called beidlefreevermont.gov. So later on, when we get to the language that requires that there be a standalone website, that website already exists, and that is the source of where I found these 4 items when I was preparing this language. So this is something that Vermont is already putting out there. So in most cases, idling violates state law, 23 VSA section 1110. Unnecessary idling harms human health, pollutes the air, wastes fuel and money, and causes excess engine wear. Based on estimates, if every motor vehicle in Vermont reduced unnecessary idling by just 1 minute per day over the course of a year, Vermonters would save over 1 million gallons of fuel and over, and I think this number probably needs to be updated on beidlefreevermont.gov, $2 million in fuel costs, and Vermont would reduce CO2 emissions by more than 10,000 metric tons. And while individual actions may be small, the cumulative impacts of idling are large. So Vermont is already disseminating that information. The public outreach campaign needs to further disseminate this information on idling through email, a dedicated webpage on idling that exists, that is linked through the websites for the Agency of Natural Resources and the Departments of Environmental Conservation, of Motor Vehicles, and of Public Safety. Also needs to disseminate information through social media platforms, community posting websites, radio, television, and printed written materials. I think if you are interested in more information about what is already going on with the state's dissemination of information on idling, you might want to hear from the Department of Environmental Conservation, Air Quality and Climate Division, unless Michelle can speak to that. They did hear testimony from, I'm completely blanking on the individual's name, on, you know, sort of the origination of the website and written materials that existed and things like that.
Idling cop, go around, check how long you idle. Okay, what's your thoughts here, folks?
In working with the Department of Environmental Conservation Office, probably here for Ritzer, yes, testified in the House. I think the thinking is these are, as mentioned by Anthea, already things that are underway. There had been some discussion about how great the AOT public outreach efforts are, and that perhaps originally the language was contemplating AOT taking over doing the public outreach for the idling campaign. And we indicated we would be happy to share our outreach strategies with DEC, and they're, you know, welcome to replicate those. But it's not clear that this language is needed to tell them to do what they're already doing. But it's up to you.
Any thoughts? No. 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 Okay. Good. All right. Good to hear that.
Okay, so now we are getting to the last 2 new sections. These are changing codified law in Title 19. If you think back to language that you worked on related to the sustainable building components, you added a new statement of policy. Section 15 is making changes to existing law in terms of the statement of policy, the general statement of policy that is in codified law. Some of what it's doing is updating it, adding in reference to the climate action plan, and sort of correcting an obsolete reference to an entity that no longer exists. But then it's also adding more to what needs to be part of the mission statement that is developed by the Agency of Transportation. So Section 10B in codified law already tells the agency to develop a mission statement that reflects a number of things. This is adding to in one of those already listed items that needs to be reflected in the agency's mission statement. Subdivision 2, this is the bottom of 22, top of 23. The need for transportation projects that will improve the state's economic infrastructure as well as the use of resources in efficient, coordinated, integrated, cost-effective, and environmentally sound ways, and that will be consistent with the recommendations of the Comprehensive Energy Plan, CEP, issued under 30 VSA Section 202B. That is existing law. They are already required to reflect that in the mission statement. Adding to that the efforts need to be consistent with the recommendations of the Climate Action Plan issued under 10 VSA Section 592 and any rules adopted in accordance with the rule adopting statute related to the Climate Action Plan. So that is updating to include reference to the Climate Action Plan whenever there's reference to the Comprehensive Energy Plan. You will see that change made many times throughout the rest of this. You see CEP, CAP will follow thereafter in terms of these changes. Adding as two other, do you want me to pause?
I just wondered how often they have to update their mission statement. Is there a requirement on
There's not a requirement on that. It's
whatever?
done periodically, and we are going to be evaluating our mission statement and plan starting this summer.
I'm gonna mirror Senator Kitchell's, what she says. I always just love when we start to tell these folks what they ought to be doing when they're already doing it. And that's what I see right here. I mean, they're already doing it, and we're just telling them that they're gonna do it when they're already in the process of doing it.
So codified law, they might have chosen to have a mission statement without codified law. Codified law is already telling them to do it. You are through what we've talked about, you are adding that the codified law is just changed to also require that their mission statement is consistent with the Climate Action Plan. I am sure that they would be doing that if you didn't tell them to do it, but the Climate Action Plan exists now. It did not exist until recently, so it wouldn't have been something that codified law would reflect. So I would say that when you were looking at sections 15 and section 16, there is new language. There definitely is new language. But there is also adding reference to the Climate Action Plan, which is sort of like a shadow reference throughout Title 19 now a little bit, because so much of the emissions come from the transportation sector. I think it would be inconsistent with language in other parts of statute if the agency wasn't considering the Climate Action Plan as it moves forward. This is making it clear that they need to.
Question, anybody talking?
Well, I'll comment maybe perhaps when Anthea finishes the whole section. And
Are we gonna have time to go? We've got to go on the floor in
Oh.
10 minutes, so are we gonna continue tomorrow? Because we can't wrap it up.
So I think I can get through these two sections with my big picture sort of
Okay,
explanation. I
good.
think you need to hear from the agency on this one. I really do.
Okay.
Is that be today or tomorrow?
let's see how we do today.
Excuse me.
Okay. And I'll be really quick with the rest of this. So as part of what needs to be considered for the mission statement, updating subdivision 2, but now adding 2 new subdivisions, 3 and 4. As part of that mission statement, needs to reflect the need for the agency to lead, assist, and partner in the transformation of the transportation sector to meet the emissions reduction requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act, codified in law, and ensure that there is an environmentally clean, efficient, multimodal system that will have economic, environmental equity, and public health benefits for all Vermonters. I don't know if they would reflect that in the mission statement if you didn't tell them to. That would be a question for the agency. Other new subdivision needs to be reflected in the mission statements. The importance of transportation infrastructure resilience and strategies to construct or retrofit or both transportation infrastructure to prepare for and adapt to changes in the climate, add redundancy and efficiency to the transportation network, and use maintenance and operational strategies to address transportation disruptions. 2 new things that would need to be considered as part of the mission statement. Subdivision B deals with coordination, planning, and education. This is the one that I referenced where there is an outdated reference. So the Vermont Climate Change Oversight Committee no longer exists. So codified law is telling the agency to coordinate their planning and education efforts with an entity that doesn't exist, instead saying they should coordinate planning and education efforts with the Vermont Climate Council, which was added as part of the Global Warming Solutions Act. The underlined 2 and the struck 2 in the beginnings of subdivisions 1 and 2, that is just something from the editors. In subdivision C, as amended by 1988 Acts and Resolves number 200, that is for me. You don't need that reference anymore because it was amended, and that is the reference that continues. Final in section 15, dealing with this general policy statement, when I said there are additions sort of anytime it said the CEP, adding the CAP, requiring that as part of the state's annual transportation program, and we're going to get more into this in section 16, that the agency needs to have appropriate consideration to local, regional, and state agency plans. As part of that, develop or incorporate designs that provide integrated, safe, and efficient transportation, and that are consistent with the recommendations of the CEP. That is existing law, not changing existing law, just adding the climate action plan after that. Going really quickly. Section 16, this is the transportation planning process. This is what is the section that kind of yields some of the contents, some of, not all the contents of the white book that you get. The changes that you're seeing in the beginning here, going from multi-modal to multimodal one word, that's from the editors. At the end of the long range systems plan subsection, having the agency to establish and implement the long range system plan as part of its planning process, adding in climate action plan after comprehensive energy plan. So that is the third iteration or the third instance of this. We have reference to the CEP, also adding in reference to the CAP, which didn't exist until recently. Last sort of change to existing law, and then we're getting to a lot of new law, adding in for part of the transportation program, the white book, the annual transportation program, needs to be developed in a fiscally responsible manner to accomplish the following objectives. And there are in current law 4 objectives that need to be considered and the agency needs to consider in developing the transportation program. One of them already addresses managing, maintaining, and improving the state's existing transportation infrastructure to provide capacity, safety, and flexibility in the most cost-effective and efficient manner. This would also require a consideration of resiliency. No changes to subdivision 2 or subdivisions 3, and then subdivision 4 also has, as part of the transportation program planning process, achieving the recommendations of the CEP and the CAP, so adding in and the CAP. Additional subdivision that needs to be an objective that's considered in the transportation planning process is transforming the transportation sector to meet the state's emissions reduction requirements and ensure that there is an environmentally clean, efficient multimodal system that will have economic, environmental equity, and public health benefits for all Vermonters. New language, completely new, subsection F, addressing emissions modeling as part of the transportation planning process. Not something that I believe is addressed in Title 19 and something that is required under the Global Warming Solutions Act and language in Title 10. So some of this language is mimicking what is already going to need to be required, but adding it into Title 19, making it a part of the transportation program that's adopted, and having responsibilities between the Agency of Natural Resources and Transportation. This is a section that I think you really need to hear from the agency about, because I can tell you what these words are, but I cannot tell you really anything about emissions modeling.
Where do you come up with all this stuff? Oh my God. Somebody gave all this stuff to you. Gee. Okay.
So super quick, the Agency of Natural Resources needs to coordinate with AOT to consider and incorporate relevant elements of the proposed transportation program and the effectiveness of those elements in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in developing the tracking and measuring progress tool that's required under Title 10. Subdivision 2 lists 3 things that need to be included in the reports that are required as part of Section 10G. So this is reporting requirements. It would then be part of your white book. It would then be attached to the back of the T-bill, adopted with the T-bill. It's sort of preserving this record of the binder that travels with the bill, gets filed with the Secretary of State's office. So included in that reporting would need to be the portion of the tracking and measuring progress tool related to the transportation program, a qualitative estimation of how effective the relevant elements of the proposed transportation program for the upcoming fiscal year will be in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and then a quantitative estimation based on that as to how much more of the greenhouse gas emissions from transportation need to be reduced for the state to reach its emissions reductions requirements, and a strategy. So it's going to have the relevant part of the tracking tool, the qualitative estimation based on the upcoming fiscal year, a quantitative estimation on how much further there is to go, and then a strategy for how that's going to be met. And then you have your effect.
They gotta build a report.
Okay.
I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Mike, are you taking us offline?
Paints it for me for right